That's how that can be. That's topic, yeah. Have we felt thought that reindeers once people but she didn't have the first one. That is probably. And you are prepared. Oh, no, yeah, we are you doing anything? Doctor's office, like each person.
Yes. Well, that's all
It's at like other country.
Oh yeah, you're from
Yeah.
Kangaroos.
The big ones.
I know a couple of your country members, young people do
Australia now? Oh. Did they do the undercovers?
Hey, good afternoon, friends. Hope you had a good lunch. So we're so lucky to have with us today Katrina Sharman and Dana Campbell, and I'll tell you a little bit about them, and then I'm sure they'll introduce themselves even more, and we'll get to listen to everything about animal law in Australia. So Ms. Sharman is an attorney qualified to practice in both California and Australia. In her former role as corporate counsel of Voiceless, the Animal Protection Institute, she helped pioneer the growth of animal law in Australia for more than 6 years. She's represented the interests of animals on state and federal government committees across Australia and has written and lectured extensively on animal law both there and in the U.S. She works in corporate law currently in LA, and she has been a director of Voiceless since 2010. Ms. Dana Campbell is presently an adjunct professor here at Lewis and Clark, really lucky. For the past 3 years, as the first CEO of this organization, she ran Voiceless, which focuses on farm animals and the commercial kangaroo industry. Just prior to that, she was a senior attorney for 12 years with the Animal Legal Defense Fund and taught as an adjunct at Cornell Law School. Ms. Campbell has advised the Delaware and New Jersey Governor's Task Forces on Animal Welfare as well as the Oregon Zoo. She's the author of the Legal Advocates Manual for Animal Abuse Criminal Cases and has been a source for innumerable television, radio, and print media interviews. And prior to Ms. Campbell's animal law career, she was the deputy district attorney for both in Oregon and Hawaii, where she successfully tried hundreds of criminal cases in court, specializing in animal cruelty and neglect, domestic violence, and child sex assault cases. So let's give a warm welcome to both Ms. Campbell and
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you today. This is actually my 5th visit to Portland, believe it or not, my 5th visit since 2002. And in that time, I've seen animal law in Australia grow an enormous amount. It now has a legitimate place in the halls of academia, in government and in the media and in Australia's courtrooms, and it's become a cutting-edge area of law that is demanding more scrutiny, more accountability and more justice for animals than ever before. Having shared that good news, I have to say that the treatment of animals in Australia is still very dire. From animals raised on factory farms to those used in biomedical research, and from animals used in entertainment to the shameful trade in live export, which my colleague Dana will be talking about today, the news is still very depressing and very bleak. The topic I'm going to be talking to you about today, the culling or harvesting of kangaroos in Australia, falls within that category. It's an important topic, a topic that's very close to my heart as an Australian, perhaps now more so that I'm living in the United States. and I can reflect from afar on the merciless killing that I know is playing out nightly across Australia, right away from the public eye. When I think of my homeland, I'm filled with an immense pride for its national beauty. From the vast dry plains of the desert to the tropical rainforests and the beaches that cling to our coastlines, Australia is a country that hosts some of the world's most exotic and diverse wildlife. Every year, thousands of people travel to Australia to cuddle a koala, marvel at a platypus, wave at a wombat and echidna or an emu. And of course, the one animal that we are most famous for, the one that we love and are seemingly most proud of, is the kangaroo. For those of you who are not familiar with our national icon, here are a couple of ambassadors. Lovely, aren't they? Kangaroos are featured on our coat of arms, our currency and our national airlines. Our sporting teams are named after them. Yet we have a strange, morally perplexing attitude towards kangaroos. For years, the reigning scientific mantra has deemed them as pests, and when that argument was challenged, they were rebranded by the government as natural resources suitable for harvesting. This enabled a lucrative commercial industry in kangaroos to emerge. Most people, not even Australians, are aware that Australia is responsible for the largest land-based wildlife slaughter on the planet. Kangaroos in Australia are technically classified as protected fauna. However, they can be lawfully killed by licensed shooters. And this regime has sanctioned the death of more than 100 million kangaroos since 1975. My task today is to take you on a brief tour of Australia's kangaroo harvesting industry. We'll start with some facts and figures and explore some myths which sustain the trade. Then we'll put on our legal hats and ask why, as in so many other areas of animal law, the law is completely failing to protect these animals. And finally, when I've depressed you all, I'll examine some international developments in this area and share a little good news and talk about how we must, like advocates everywhere, keep focusing on this. Before I get started, I just wanted to take a brief moment to acknowledge the work of Voiceless, which was mentioned to you earlier. As some of you know, I worked as legal counsel for Voiceless for 6 years before heading across to the States. And the organisation was founded by Brian Sherman and Ondine Sherman. It was a result of their shared vision. And Voiceless has always been at the forefront of animal law issues as a result of the vision that they had. And I wanted to acknowledge Dana as well, who, as you know, was also the CEO of Voiceless for 3 years. I also wanted to acknowledge Emmanuel Jeffrey, who's the current legal counsel for the organisation and who's doing a fabulous job and who's really helped equip me to speak with you today. So if you have a moment afterwards, have a look at the Voiceless website, and if you want to get more involved in the issues that Dana and I are sharing with you, please reach out to the Voiceless team. So to begin, Australia's commercial killing of kangaroos centres around 4 mainland states: New South Wales, Queensland, Western Australia and South Australia. There's also a small industry involving the Bennett's wallaby and the Tasmanian pedomilin occurring in Tasmania, which is that little island floating off the bottom of Australia. There are more than 60 species of kangaroos in Australia, and 4 of these are targets for the commercial kangaroo industry. And here they are: the red kangaroo, the eastern grey, the western grey, and the common wallaroo. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the slaughter of kangaroos in Australia represents the largest wildlife cull that's government sanctioned on the planet. The annual slaughter of kangaroos exceeds that of buffalo, bear, antelope, caribou, elk, moose, reindeer, and wild boars. Approximately 28 million kangaroos have been killed in the last decade alone. And that figure does not include the 8 million joeys, or baby kangaroos, who were ripped from their mothers' pouches and simply treated as collateral damage of the kangaroo industry. Close to 3 million kangaroos and 1 million joeys are killed every year in Australia. Their flesh is used as a source of meat for human consumption or pet food, and their fur and skins are used in popular exports such as soccer boots, baseball mitts, and souvenirs ranging from the sublime to the ridiculous. And if you don't believe me, jump on the web and you will find kangaroo paw back scratchers made out of real kangaroo, kangaroo paw bottle openers, and even a scrotum key ring. The scientific community in Australia has traditionally demonised kangaroos as pests who compete with livestock for food. This myth was, and still is, deeply embedded in the Australian psyche. Thus, hunting them is often seen as a constructive act, a kind of damage mitigation. Setting aside the fact that kangaroos are actually native to Australia and might be ethically entitled to compete with introduced species such as livestock, there is a growing body of research which shows that the pest allegation is actually flawed. For example, a 2006 government review of the kangaroo industry determined that kangaroos should not actually be considered pests. The review found that competition with livestock typically only occurs in times of drought, and that artificial watering points for livestock in the arid interior have little impact on the distribution and densities of kangaroo populations. More importantly, recent government data suggests that, contrary to popular assertion, kangaroos in New South Wales, at least, rather than becoming overabundant, may actually be in decline. So in the face of this evidence, the government has rebranded kangaroos a sustainable resource that can and should be hunted consistently with the principles of good wildlife management. The quota for 2013 was very generous to the kangaroo industry, approximately 5.8 million. These numbers do not include the joeys that I mentioned are often referred to as collateral damage, nor do they include the animals that are killed on a non-commercial basis by farmers who are simply not accounted for, nor do they include the kangaroos hit by vehicles, which could totally blow out the overall number of animals that are being considered. For example, in 2009, there were 15,000 reported accidents involving kangaroos. These kinds of variables expose kangaroo quota setting as anything but a precise science. The truth is, no one really knows how many kangaroos are being killed, and the setting of a sustainable quota is ambitious, to say the least. Despite the fuzziness around the sustainability of the kangaroo quota, the kangaroo industry has embraced the notion that the commercial killing of kangaroos is environmentally beneficial, and that kangaroos are the new green meat. The argument put forward in this context goes something along these lines. Kangaroos are soft-footed animals. They're naturally adapted to the Australian environment. Livestock, on the other hand, are hard-hoofed animals and an introduced species that can damage Australia's fragile ecosystems. Since kangaroos are supposedly an environmentally friendly source of meat, they should be killed in large numbers with a view to replacing livestock. This is called the livestock replacement theory. The problem with the livestock replacement theory is that to date there's been no evidence that a single animal has been replaced. In other words, there's no evidence of Australia's appetite for livestock waning anytime soon. And as you'll hear from Dana today, even if Australia did decide that it should farm less livestock, it would simply export them overseas. So in truth, this idea of kangaroo killing being an environmentally good idea is simply no more than another market for animal produce, piggybacking on the green is good fad. Let's talk about the law. Even if one accepted the principle of wildlife harvesting, its implementation in Australia is woefully inadequate because of the high degree of reliance on industry self-regulation and the complete failure of the law to provide meaningful protection to kangaroos. The 30,000-foot view of the regulatory structure is this. Each state that kills kangaroos sanctions the taking of that animal as part of the regulatory framework for wildlife management. For instance, the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Act classifies kangaroos as protected fauna, but it permits them to be killed by licensed shooters. Shooters can only kill in designated commercial killing zones, and they must comply with a national code of practice for the humane shooting of kangaroos. Each shooter is given a number of tags which they must attach to a carcass, and technically they will only get paid if the kangaroo is killed in accordance with the code. Now, in principle, This might sound like a workable regulatory structure, but it only works if it stands up to scrutiny and if shooters self-regulate. And as I'm going to demonstrate to you now, both of these assumptions are seriously flawed. First, the code defines a humane death as one in which the animal dies instantaneously through a clean shot to the brain. The diagram that is on the screen comes directly from the National Code of Practice. Now, pragmatically speaking, this is incredibly difficult to achieve. This is because kangaroos are not farmed like cows or pigs or chickens. They're wild animals. They experience very high levels of stress when they're farmed, thus they can't be raised in captive environments. This leaves the kangaroo industry with no choice but to hunt them like game. Kangaroos are shot in the wild at night when they're most active, and shooters must contend with such things as impaired vision due to darkness and distance, weather conditions, the small target size of a kangaroo's head, unexpected movements of the kangaroos who are startled from others that are being shot at, and their own lack of skill or experience. The cruelty inherent in this mode of killing is largely hidden from the public eye. And now I have to issue the compulsory warning that what I may show next may offend some of you, so please look away if you don't want to see something horrible but true. Most kangaroo killing takes place in remote areas under cover of darkness, so monitoring and compliance is virtually impossible to measure and enforce. Anecdotal evidence gathered from hunters suggests that there will be times when the mouth, forearms, ears, eyes and nose of kangaroos are simply blown off. And in such situations, there's no incentive to assure that kangaroos will receive a humane death. You might recall that I mentioned the tags earlier on. Hunters don't get paid if they kill animals in this fashion, so there's just simply no incentive to dispose of them in what some would say is a humane way. So these kangaroos are often left to die a slow and painful death of shock, starvation or injury. And estimates, as you can imagine, are very difficult to obtain, but the data that has been assembled suggests that there could be any number between 120,000 and 1 million kangaroos that are misshot annually. Again, these numbers just don't factor into the quotas that I was referring to previously. And lack of industry monitoring means that the real numbers are simply unknown. Another thing about kangaroos. Kangaroos are very social animals. They live in large groups called mobs, and mothers often travel with a joey in their pouch and a young at foot or a dependent young. The Code of Practice requires that pouch young and dependent joeys be euthanized when their mother is killed. And again, we're not talking here about a death by way of lethal injection or a death by way of gas. To the contrary, what you can see on the screen are the prescribed humane methods of killing for kangaroos. And just to go over them, for a small furless pouch young, a single forceful blow to the base of the skull or stunning immediately followed by decapitation. For furred pouch young, that's a joey that's slightly older, a single forceful blow to the base of the skull. And for young at foot, a single shot to the brain or heart, where it can be delivered accurately and in safety. And just remember in this context again, this is happening to joeys in the middle of the Australian outback in the country under cover of darkness at night time. So the ability to enforce whether this is being done is extremely difficult, to say the least. So the acceptability of these killing methods, while clearly open to debate, is almost not the issue itself. The problem is that the potential for abuse of the killing methods is heightened because shooters are not provided with any kind of formal training as to the correct manner to kill joeys. And again, I have to warn you, there's a very disturbing slide coming. Anecdotal evidence suggests that some shooters fail to check the pouches of joeys, shot females for joeys, as required by the code, leaving them to suffer a prolonged death. And others simply leave the young at foot to escape, to die of starvation, predation or hypothermia. And this is just another slide from a vet report showing that a joey here was found after a killing event and was presumably left to die of exposure. In other words, it wasn't killed in accordance with the code. To make matters worse, when it comes to enforcement, there's virtually no monitoring or auditing in the field to ensure compliance with the code of practice. When kangaroos are killed, their bodies are taken to chillers, which are these giant fridges in the middle of the outback, essentially, in the middle of the Australian bush. And later on, they're taken to processors, where their carcasses are prepared for meat. Some inspection of chillers and processors does occur, but a number of reports have suggested that they simply can't be relied upon to assure compliance with the code of practice. And even if a violation is actually detected, the remedies, the enforcement mechanisms are extremely weak. For instance, they vary from state to state, but as you can see from the slide there, they involve such measures as penalty infringement notices, written cautions, licence suspensions, and as with most cruelty crimes in Australia, the penalties are very, very low. For example, in South Australia, which is one of the kill states, the maximum penalty for permit holders for supplying carcasses of kangaroos that have not been killed in accordance with the code is $1,000. Given the inherent leniency in the enforcement tools, it seems that the legislators are simply signalling to the perpetrators that these are not crimes that should be taken seriously. So, as you can imagine, many Australians are concerned about this issue. They're also concerned about the clubbing of baby harp seals in Canada, the harpooning of whales in the Australian whale sanctuary, and the slaughter of dolphins at Taiji. And they should be. But given the facts that I'm sharing with you today, you can imagine that our ability to speak with any kind of moral authority in matters of international wildlife law has been called into question. And as one news commentator, Paul Sheehan, has said, when it comes to hypocrisy about animal cruelty, we are world class. Not everyone is concerned about hypocrisy. Until 2009, Russia was the principal importer of Australia's kangaroo meat, taking approximately 70% of roux industry exports. And it continues to be a major player today. Over the years, the trade to Russia has ebbed and flowed, primarily because of hygiene concerns. For example, the $180 million kangaroo meat trade to Russia was suspended back in 2008 and then reopened in November of 2012. In May this year, imports were banned again due to hygiene concerns. However, it was interesting because news of the hygiene scare that occurred in May 2012 was never actually made public at the time. News only broke in August of this year when an animal rights activist went on to one of the Russian websites that talked about Australian kangaroo exports to see if Australian kangaroo exports had been caught up in the bans that were imposed on that country as a result of MH17 going down. So it's very interesting. These are not matters that are really highlighted in public debate. And it suggests that whilst animal cruelty issues are important and are very much at the forefront of the Australian debate in some senses, it's food safety concerns that to date have really had the most crippling effect on the kangaroo culling trade. So in light of the fluctuations that I've talked about with Russia, which is obviously one of our major exporters, and the fact that the market is no longer as predictable as it once was, the Australian government has set its sights firmly on China. And a number of delegations have already gone to China or come to Australia with the intent of encouraging China to embrace the kangaroo trade. Were that to happen, one can imagine its impact on export volumes. Current estimates show that China's growing middle class will prompt an increase in demand for meat of nearly 17% over the next 8 years. And that presents a very lucrative market for the kangaroo industry. So, on the one hand, Australia is at the crossroads because if the market to China opens up, the kangaroo industry is really going to explode in terms of its ability to expand and be a very lucrative market. On the other hand, if China doesn't open up and Russia continues to waver in its support of the kangaroo industry, it may well be much better news for kangaroos. But let's shine the spotlight a little closer to home, because sitting here today, thousands of miles across the Pacific away from Australia, you might think that this is kind of a non-issue for you. It's something that is not really as relevant to the US economy, certainly not something that you could influence in any way. Just another depressing international issue out of your reach. This is really not the case. The US has been at the site of numerous debates concerning the commercial killing of kangaroos, primarily because it does continue to be a lucrative market for kangaroo products. And if you don't believe me, again, you can jump on a website and find that kangaroo jerky is sold just down the road in Oregon, so in Portland. Kangaroo products were actually banned here in 1974 on a federal basis, and the ban was lifted in 1981 due to effective lobbying of the Australian government and reassurance to the US that kangaroo numbers were not actually in decline. I don't have time to go through a kind of state-by-state approach of the kangaroo trade and its effect on each of the US states, but it is worth noting that there's some interesting legislative developments afoot which could shape the future of the US kangaroo trade. And by way of example, in California, in 2011, the then Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger signed Senate Bill 1345, which some of you may remember as SB 1345, which extended a phase-out, essentially, of the importation of kangaroo parts and allowed the kangaroo meat trade to continue to flourish in California until 2016. So if any of you have a calendar here that reaches ahead 2 years, pop that one in the diary, because if you're Californian, that's going to be coming up for debate again in 2016, and it obviously has the capacity to influence the importation of kangaroo products to one state in the US at least. And if the regulatory environment is moving too slowly, there is also obviously the combined effect of law and public debate on actions that companies are taking. And interestingly, this has been one of the areas in which the kangaroo advocates have seen most reform in recent years. For instance, Adidas, which is a leading supplier of sports shoes that for a good period of time involved kangaroo leather, was previously involved in legal action in California because of its association with the kangaroo trade. It's now moving away from using kangaroo leather in its shoes, and I believe in fact agreed that it will cease to do that as of 2012. And of course, one can never underestimate the impact of celebrities on the movement. And soccer icon David Beckham, who many of you will know, stopped wearing kangaroo leather boots in 2006 after he was sent a video depicting some of the images which are associated with what I've talked to you about today. So in conclusion, the current situation is bad. It's very bad for kangaroos. This little fellow here is one of the lucky ones who I have the privilege of having met, and he is raised among with a number of other roos who are orphaned as a result of these activities that I've been talking about. So there's good news for kangaroos like him. The news for the rest of them is not so good right now, and that's because of the three myths that I've talked to you about today. The fact that kangaroos are considered pests, the fact that killing them is considered a good thing for the environment, and the fact that there's this idea out there that the killing of kangaroos in Australia is going on in some kind of a humane fashion, as opposed to being a large-scale, extremely cruel annual slaughter. But as I said earlier, the kangaroo industry is very much at the crossroads right now, and with imports to Russia floundering and China not yet on board, the future for the kangaroo industry remains uncertain. And I think Dana will probably comment on this, having been in Australia and been the CEO of Voiceless for a period of time. But there are certainly a large number of shooters that are considering leaving the industry at the moment because it simply doesn't pay, it can't be relied upon right now. Of course, that could all change overnight if we discover a new export market. And then, of course, there's the growing number of corporations that are being forced to assess their use of kangaroo products as a result of the cruelty that is becoming much more a part of the public debate about kangaroos. So there is a ray of hope, and you know, in animal law, sometimes a ray of hope is all that you need. Joyce has certainly talked about, all of us dreaming, the fact that you must dream in animal law. And there's Aristotle's quote that some of you may be familiar with, which says that hope is a waking dream. So I like to think that there is hope for Australia's kangaroos, and I'd like to think that if we all continue to advocate as we do here, eloquently, strategically, and with vision, that we can make a better place for us and a better future, certainly, for Australia's kangaroos. Thank you very much.
Exit. Out of PowerPoint, or just still nice. Yep. Okay. That was great. Katrina, very smooth and polished, and you never know you've been away from speaking for 1 minute. So that's great. And thanks for the nice introduction, Jacqueline. It's really nice to be home after my 3-year stint in Australia. It was a dream of mine to be able to live and work there for a while and get to know the country. But Portland is my hometown. I'm a native, and I'm an alumnus of Lewis and Clark Law School, predating animal law. But it is nice to be back among friends again in the animal law community. I am going to spend some time talking to you about my experience down there with Voiceless and in the animal law community, but on a different topic, which has also kind of captured the momentum and the public's attention right now, and that's the live export industry there. And so, with that, let me start with how this started. This was not on the radar of Voiceless or really anybody when I first got there in early 2011. And what happened was another organization there called Animals Australia had persons on the ground that they've been doing investigations for some time out in the field in some of the live export markets overseas where Australia's animals ended up, such as particularly in the Middle East, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, some of those countries over there. And what they did in one of these investigations is they took an ABC News reporter with them. Now, ABC is the broadcast station over there that's probably most like maybe NPR or something like that, public broadcasting here. It's publicly funded, and they took an investigative team over there with cameras, or at some point they did, but they, Animals Australia, I think, filmed some footage of their own themselves. In any case, they worked together and put together this hour-long program that aired on May 30th of 2011, and it woke the country up. It's not an understatement. It was shocking, this footage and this film was. And keep in mind, in Australia, it's very much more progressive than perhaps we are in the U.S. Once I got there, I saw maybe that we were just a little bit, I don't know, provincial in our viewing habits. They put very much more sexual-oriented material on TV and violence on TV to a greater degree than we do. And they aired this footage on there, and the country just went nuts. We, had no idea this kind of stuff was happening to the cattle and livestock that was leaving Australia and ending up in foreign lands, and it caused an outrage. And the name of the program that evening was A Bloody Business, and basically Australia woke up to the idea that maybe we do care about our animals, and maybe we do, want to have a stake in what happens to them even when they're not on our shores anymore. And as part of the program, they did have some quotes there from Dr. Temple Grandin, as well as from industry and from one of the exporters as well, talking about it. I don't see the play button. Oh, there it is, okay. And I'll give you the same warning as Katrina did, that this is somewhat graphic footage, but keep in mind an entire country watched it, and my motto as an animal lawyer has always been, if they have to endure it, the least we can do is stand to watch it. And so if you really can't, you can avert your eyes, but we're all grown-ups here, and I'm going to go ahead and the original program that aired was an hour long, and I don't have a good excerpt from that program, but what I do have is a later investigation. In fact, the most recent one that just occurred in July of this year. The footage is and the story tells us very much the same. This is only an 8-minute clip, but it really tells the story about what is going on in the live export trade in a way that I would not be able to describe for you, and it will form the basis for the rest of our discussion here. seeing here is multiple attempts to try and slit the throat. Keep in mind with cattle, they've got, I think, like two almost blood arteries that need to be secreted. Usually this is one. This is in a slaughterhouse in Gaza. So not the kind of sterile systems that we have in the U.S.
Was this undercover or they knew that they were?
No, this is open in the open. They were allowed in to film agricultural. Going on than actual severing, which is part of what constitutes torture, I think. Sorry about that. Yeah.
I have a question. Were these animals raised in Australia and then sent there for slaughter?
Yes. Yep. They're raised in Australia, so that's and they're tagged and they go up on these ships, which are, probably the longest journeys that any cattle in the world make because of the distance from Australia to any place else. So they're on them for up to 5 weeks. And that's after they've traveled over land for usually several days before getting on the boat. So it's a long and torturous process, to put it mildly. When the Bloody Business episode on the ABC's Four Corners program aired, the country rallied and basically took to the streets to protest in a way that hadn't been seen there in a long time. And again, I'm going to refer to Aussies generally as an American, but they're pretty laid-back folks. Most of the time, and it takes a lot to get them riled up, and which is part of what I loved about it. They're just not as type A as Americans can be sometimes, but man, they were mad about this. And they took to the streets to protest in Sydney and in Melbourne and in Brisbane and all around the country, usually on coordinated days, to say, we want this to stop, and we want it to stop now. We don't want our cattle being subjected to these conditions any longer. We had no idea this is going on, and we don't want it to go on. And interestingly, the government stopped it. In June, this footage aired May 30th, the government did institute a ban on exporting any animals until they could look into what was going on and what kind of controls were in place by the exporters and by the government itself. It's an industry that's regulated by the Department of Agriculture, not unlike it is here in the U.S., which many would seem to think is an implicit conflict of interest, and I'm sure it probably is. So the government, the department, the Minister for Agriculture did institute a ban on live exports from Australia, and that lasted about a month. And then they started up again, and the government assured everybody, well, we've got controls in place, and we know what's going on now. Mostly the outcry from the livestock ranchers in the outback and across the country had a lot to do with getting the trade reinstated, as well as threats from Indonesia and other trading partners that they were going to pursue independent meats or other markets if we didn't return back to exporting to their countries and giving them back their meat supply as soon as possible. So there was trade considerations at stake, as well as domestic employment issues and market issues at home. As I said, the live export trade in Australia subjects the animals to probably the furthest distance than anywhere else in the world, going to these faraway markets, and it involves just incredible numbers of animals when you take into account not just the cattle, but the sheep and the goats that are exported as well. Well over 3 million every year go overseas from Australian shores, comprised of 1.13 million head of cattle, which is about a $1.05 billion business. And if you add in the sheep and goats, that's the other 2.1 million head, comprising $193 million in production in Australia. And again, I touched on these a little bit in the videos you've seen. It's arguably the worst in the world because of the high numbers of animals and the extreme distances they travel. And again, even before they board a ship, and a lot of the discussion and debate in the country has centered on the export from the country, but actually a lot of trauma and injuries and deaths occur en route to the transport ports, the ports of Culling, Adelaide, and Fremantle, and those places. Where the animals are stressed by food and water deprivation, traveling over several days before they get to the port cities. They're crowded together, very, very high stocking densities and very high temperatures, and that can occur for up to 50 hours without any relief. And it's during the course of that some of them are in fact trampled and injured and never make it to the boats or shunted aside or even shipped while injured. Nobody seems to be really keeping track of those numbers or the condition they're in when they load, nor are they required to. Animals shipped from Australia can be confined for up to 3 weeks on these boats, again, overcrowded in the heat, without relief, with the stench of their own excrement. A lot of times with the sheep, they switch them to pellets because it's easier to transport and feed them with that, and the sheep won't eat the pellets, and so they start a slow starvation or get some other kind of disease because of the close quarters. And a lot of them just don't make it. Did you have a question again?
Yeah, I was just going to wonder, why are they shipping them to begin with? Are they going to keep them over there, or is it being then going to come back to Australia?
Couple reasons. One is because they want the fresh meat and they want to be able to butcher them there in their own way. Or the other is breeding cattle to replenish their own herds overseas. So that doesn't even... and the rules I'm going to talk about don't even cover any of the breeding cattle, so keep that in mind as we go through them. So mostly for fresh meat purposes. For the overseas markets, yeah, and it's very lucrative for the Australian farmers to be able to do that, particularly as meat consumption gradually decreases. In the Western countries, it's sustainable still in other countries. This is the type of ship that they go across in. Again, you can see you can load thousands and thousands of animals on a ship like this. Each of these containers, it's like a little ant farm almost in there. There's tons and tons of animals crowded onto these ships. for their overseas journeys. This was taken from a export company's website of one of their ships. So we've talked about high temperatures and poor ventilation can contribute to fatal heat stroke, especially for those whose physiology is not well suited to hot climates. I talked about the pellets already. Failure to eat also can lead to salmonellosis. Salmonella, as we know it in human beings, they're subject to it as well. When sheep get salmonellosis, it causes a very, very toxic bunch of kind of diarrhea that then the rest of them are living in. They're vomiting, they're not able to retain anything, and they're passing it again because they're in such close quarters. So the mortality rate is high if you get that kind of an introduction into the stock. And around half of sheep mortalities do occur that way. And again, not unlike a hoarding situation that we deal with every day here in the States when you've got a lot of animals packed in a small area. Their waste creates an ammonia gas that gets up into the respiratory systems of the animals there. This is the same thing that happens in the holds of these transport boats. And it irritates their eyes, their nasal cavities, the respiratory tracts. And again, further causing disease, which they then pass on to them. It's like a big vicious circle throughout the packed quarters. Morbidity and mortality rates. Again, I've listed some materials, I should say, in the conference website, and it includes the full episode of A Bloody Business if you have some light entertainment you want to watch some night for an hour. The whole entire program is there, as well as the rules that I'm going to be talking about in this thing. And I also have citations available myself for everything that's in these slides. If you're curious about having those, just email me. I'll give you the email at the end, and I can give you all of that. These particular figures are all government-provided figures from the Department of Agriculture for the very, very few things that are tracked. One of them is the mortality rates, the death rates. And so the government guidelines require that any death rate per shipment above these minimums must be reported to the government so they can track and take statistics, keep track of these statistics of what the death rates are. So for example, if you have a sheep transport ship and the death rate on that sheep transport, I can't remember whether it's sheep or cattle, that's 2%, but if the number of mortalities are at 2% or over for that shipment, then you need to report it. Now, the problem with that is you've got industry out there touting, look at what we're doing, we have a death rate, we're losing, less than 1 to 2% of our shipments. The problem with that is when you start looking at the hard numbers and you see, that 2% number sounds very low, but if you look at it in proportion and use real numbers for that, and you're thinking, that there's, 3 million animals shipped a year, what's 2% of that? That's tens of thousands of animals that are dying. Tens of thousands. You don't see that every year, over and over again. You don't see industry talking about that at all. It also doesn't take into account they're not exporters are not required to report at all, and the government does not track at all the morbidity numbers, and it's actually more animals are likely to suffer from some kind of poor welfare or disease or injury during these trips. That never becomes anything that's tracked or taken account of. It's just simply not a number that's collected by anyone, the exporters or the government. So those animals are not a factor in these half of 1% to 2% figures that are required to be reported by the government. Am I talking too fast? Okay. I've got a lot to cover. The 4 biggest markets, again, according to the government for Australian exports, are Indonesia. That's the trading partner that we ran into the first initial investigations that were reported back in 2011. And it was the trade with Indonesia that came under that initial ban by the government for a month. Second place is Vietnam, third is Israel, and fourth is Kuwait. So you can see it's pretty global in terms of where Australia's animals end up. As we saw some of this in the video, once they get off the boat, they go into these markets. A lot of times they are very ill-equipped slaughterhouses, and use that term very broadly, or abattoirs, as we say in Australia. As you can see, it's not a matter of just putting them through chutes and with white-coated men, slashing them very effectively and efficiently. They're tied up to posts, and they're put in restraint boxes, and they're sliding around on cement so that they fall and crush their bones as they fall, and at that point are disabled enough that some guy with a big knife can get in there and cut their throat. It's very primitive in some of these places. In other places, when you talk about, particularly in the Middle East and some of the religious holidays, they just come off the boat and they get loaded up and they go home for slaughter in these people's homes. And you can just imagine how well that goes in terms of being a humane process. And so all of this has also been captured on film, either by people who live in those countries who object to the practice, or investigators from Australia's charities, not the exporters or the government, that have done these investigations. So it's once they're all off the boat, it's kind of like all bets are off. And that's, I think, the biggest problem with live exports for any country is there's really no, as you know this as lawyers, there's no rule of law, there's no jurisdiction, that you have no way to enforce any of your own rules abroad. It's nice to have trade agreements and discussions and MOUs and things like that, but really once they get there, it's hands off, they're their animals, and off they go to whatever, final destination. So as we've seen in the videos, they can be subjected to very painful handling techniques in order to make them submit so they can be slaughtered, such as the use of physical force. We did see the eye gouging that has occurred in a very large number of the videos that have come back from overseas as a way to try and subdue them. It doesn't look very effective to me, frankly. It just looks sadistic. Kicking, hitting, poking, tail twisting was something that we didn't see in this video. That was in the original video from May of 20, which, bending it in half and twisting, extremely painful for the cow, as a way to sort of get them to lie down. Tendon slashing, we did see that in the video that aired, as a way to disable them and get them down to the ground where they can be further slaughtered. What the investigators from Animals Australia found during their initial investigations was that the exporters, the people in the slaughterhouses in the overseas markets, were using what's called Mark I boxes, which is a version of what you saw in the beginning of that footage. It's not a rotating box, but it is a square box, and the cattle come down the chute into the box, and a rope is tied around their legs while they're in the back legs while they're in there. And then they open it up into so they have the box here, and then it's a sloping concrete platform. So when they come out and try and run away out of the box, they fall down on the concrete platform, slam their head into it, break their ribs onto it. They're thrashing around because their back legs are still tied up in the box, and then the knife guy goes at it from there. And they usually throw water both over the cattle, which further distresses them and also helps make the platform more slippery. So, we're talking about very sophisticated methods in some of these countries. And I say that my only joke for today. It's just horrific. I don't know how else to describe it in some of these places where they end up. Anyway, these Mark I boxes that they use that are just so horrible to restrain them and then they go collapsing down out of them are specifically prohibited by the World Organization for Animal Health, which is basically the global policeman for animal welfare among trading partner countries. And interestingly, these Mark I boxes that the investigators from Australia found there were specifically marked in big stencil letters so as not to leave any doubt with Live Corp and Meat and Livestock Australia, so that we knew exactly where these boxes came from and who was supplying them and paying for them and setting them up in these countries. And that also appeared very clearly on the film. So the first thing the government said was, well, we're not going to have those Mark I boxes there anymore. You industry bad boys, get those out of there. And so they did. So then everybody kind of went back to business again. They just didn't use those boxes anymore. So they can say at least they've made that change. One of the other things the investigators found, and again, the initial investigation from that Bloody Business show, I think, was at 10 different slaughterhouses where they found these kinds of violations overseas, and I think it may be up to 50 different instances of of the type of stuff that we saw today. And in looking over that footage, they determined that it took an average of 11 cuts to the throat, and sometimes up to 33 to slaughter fully conscious cattle. So this is, again, without any kind of captive bull stunning as we do here in the U.S. or any other kind of pre-slaughter stunning. They're just hacking away, as you saw in there, trying to get them, particularly with the cattle, less of a problem with the sheep and the goats. They didn't struggle as much, and clearly they're not as big. They can be picked up and thrown down. But with the cattle, it was an issue. This is an example of what I'm talking about, is sheep on their way home for a religious slaughter in Kuwait. And they just take them up off the boat and put them in the car, and off they go. These are live, living, conscious sheep. And you can imagine it's probably over 100 degrees on this particular day as they're being loaded up. And again, I note that these markets and these cattle and sheep and things that are ended up in these places, these are not allowed under Australian laws and regulations. These are not approved slaughterhouses that we're seeing footage for, that our animals are nevertheless somehow mysteriously ending up in. They're not part of the trade channels that have been established through the two government systems. Once they get there, they're somehow ending up in these unauthorized slaughterhouses and in these people's trunks of their cars and going home. There's other horrific footage in Israel where they're just basically being slaughtered on the street by whoever happens to come along. There's just really no accountability once they're off the boat. And as I just touched on, this is all conscious slaughter. There's no requirement either in the OIE, the World Animal Health Organization's rules, or in many of these countries, that the animals be stunned prior to slaughter. So they are awake and conscious, which has been, I think, the biggest objection by the Australian public, is the idea that this is happening to live and conscious and struggling animals, sometimes for up to 20 minutes before they actually lose consciousness or pass away. And I consider that significant torture that occurs before they lose consciousness in very many of these countries. So the law, the regulations in Australia is something we call SCAS. It refers to the Initials Export Supply Chain Assurance System. This is something that the government came up with after this all came to light and we had the protests and the ban. The government said, okay, we need to do something. So they came up with a supply chain idea to govern transport, handling, and slaughter that complies with the OIE regulations, which I'll be talking about next. And also came up with these methods to control and trace through the supply chain, where our cattle comes from and where they end up, which is how we ended up with the ear tags, and why the investigators have been very clear about filming the ear tags in each one of these films, because sure as you know, the first time this happened, I think this came to light years ago, the industry, people said, well, how do you know they're Australian cattle, and how do you know what this is, and the film's been doctored, and how do we know this is real, and all those kinds of things. So they've learned over time, you need to get all this kind of stuff, and you need to get the livestock marking, the live court mark on the Mark 1 boxes, you need to get the ear tags on film, all of that. So they set up this new supply assurance system that they're touting will help address all of these problems, and now we can go back to doing everything we did before, and it'll be fine for the animals. And we've also set up an independent auditing system, which oddly enough, when Voices started asking questions about exactly what that means and looking further into the regulations, being a legal body as we were, we found that the independent auditor means that somebody has to be supplied by the exporter and employed by the exporter. It wasn't a government official, it's not any kind of an independent vet or animal welfare person, it's just someone the vet that the exporter hires. It could be a vet, it could be just an independent auditor to be on the boats, and that's their version of independence. So again, none of the investigations of how these came to light was conducted by the government, monitoring its own rules. Today it's all been done by private charitable organizations. But now it's okay because we have industry self-regulating. The supply chain, the SCAS rules say that they aim to detect animal cruelty. However, that's only after it occurs. There's nothing about this new supply chain system the government set up that purports to prevent it from occurring in the first place. So we haven't really stopped any cruelty. We just learned how to recognize it, I guess, and report it. assuming that the exporters, auditors, in fact, do that. So an outline of some of the failings of the SCAS regulations. First of all, in trying to follow the World Animal Health Organizations, and it's OIE because I think that's how what the French words are comparable to that. So I think it was, I can't remember what it is in French, but it stands for the World Animal Health Organization. Allows for animals to be slaughtered while fully conscious, which falls way below Australian standards, which do require pre-slaughter stunning. So we're saying it's okay for other countries to do something that we would not allow ourselves in our own country, in Australia. And indeed, the World Animal Health rules allow for that as well. They advise basically try not to do that, but it's not prohibited. A second problem with the SCAS rulings are that exporters aren't required to disclose certain matters of health, such as the condition of the animals at loading and unloading. Again, remember I mentioned that there's no provision for checking their health as they go onto the boats. They could already be injured and sick by the time they get there before they start their 5-week journey. And nobody's really keeping track of that. And again, nobody's really keeping track of the conditions and method of slaughter, except apparently Animals Australia. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the SCAS rules do not apply at all to the export of breeding animals, and there are thousands and thousands of particularly breeder cattle sent overseas to increase the herds of the native animals overseas. So they don't come under any of these kind of livestock rules at all. They're not accounted for, they go off, and we never hear from them again. Now, the World Organization for Animal Health rules can be found, and they cover transport of animals by air. The U.S. does actually export a lot of animals by air, as it turns out, in addition to the animals it takes to Canada and Mexico, as well as by sea. Australia, I don't think, takes any animals by air. I think it's all by sea. But again, one of the problems I've learned over the years as an animal lawyer in looking at legislation is, what do the definitions say? And it's one of the first things I teach my students is, what does the definition say? What is and isn't covered? Well, interestingly enough, there's just really no helpful definitions in much of these animal welfare rules. It's very, very broad language. They use a lot of modifiers in terms of, well, if it's suitable for the animal, then do this, or if possible, then do this, but if not, then, anything goes kind of thing. So certainly they weren't written by me. I'd do completely different. Enforcement, again, if you have rules, they're only as good as enforcement. So is there enforcement by the government? I think clearly we've covered that, and the answer is no. Since the SCAS system was implemented, there have been at least 42 separate incidences of violation since 2012. Now, the SCAS system came into effect in late 2011 and went on for a bit before some more investigations were undertaken by Animals Australia. But if you go to the Department of Agriculture's website, they have a nice checklist of every reported incident that's come into them. So this is the government's own information. A clear majority of them were reported by charitable organizations. There's a few violations that were actually reported by the exporter themselves. But when I say 42 incident complaints, that means 42 separate occasions. There could be up to 50 different violations within each incident. So this is under the new regulated system. And as I said, the video we saw at the beginning was taken as recently as July of this year in Gaza. So nothing has really changed, and nothing's really being enforced by the Australian government. And if you look at the disposition on them, they'll either say pending, and this could be for cases that they've had for over a year. And you tell me what kind of evidence you're going to still be looking for a year later for an animal that was slaughtered a year ago and got off a boat a year ago. So they're either pending or not enough evidence, and none of them have had really any kind of significant disposition at all. There have been no sanctions. There have been no delicensing of any of the exporters in Australia as a result of this SCAS system. And again, as I stated earlier, there's really no ability to enforce our own standards abroad. It's very naive and idealistic to believe that we ever could. In the midst of all this, we had the Pakistan live export disaster, in which, nobody ever thought of this. So not only do we have unauthorized
slaughterhouses within these approved countries slaughtering animals. We have another incident where, shipment of 21,000, this is how big these boats are, 21,000 sheep going to Bahrain. And they get to Bahrain, and the Bahrain authorities decide they have scabby mouth disease, and we're not letting them unload. So, great, they've traveled for over 3 weeks, plus overland, and it's 40 degrees there, which translates to over 100 Fahrenheit, and they can't get off the boat, and they have nowhere else to go. So Bahrain won't take them, and Bahrain was an approved country, so Bahrain sends them back out to sea. Now they're like a ship without a country, literally, floating around with this 21,000 cattle, while Australia scrambles to try and make arrangements with some other country that will take them, and also to confirm whether they in fact do have scabby mouth, which it appears to be an issue. So after much scrambling, they decide we'll send them to Pakistan, which is not an approved country under the SCAS scheme, but they sort of make some revisions to SCAS so that it'll fit Pakistan, and we decide they're going to go to Pakistan. Well, they get to Pakistan, and Pakistan unloads them, and days later decide, well, they're diseased, and we've got to we're going to put down 9,000 of them. And Australia, hits the roof, and we've all been monitoring this day by day back home. And they're put to death horrifically. Some are buried alive, some are stabbed, some are not. In the meantime, Australia's trying to jockey and get our own vets in there and do their own examinations. And in the meantime, everything goes south, and the other 12,000 are slaughtered as well. The entire ship of 21,000 sheep are slaughtered to no end, for no use, for no reason, after suffering at sea for weeks and weeks in the hot and weather. Just a disaster all the way around.
When was that?
August of 2012. At days, already at sea for 33 days. And just a disaster. So in terms of enforcement, industry enforcement, not happening. We've talked about that already, the idea that industry can self-regulate. Apparently industry came out in some of the Freedom of Information Act requests that industry had known about these practices for up to 10 years, and nothing had changed until we had people protesting in the streets. And again, it's really been up to charitable organizations to monitor what's happening. Organization called Animals Angels monitors what's happening in the ports as they arrive to get ready on the boats, since nobody else is keeping track of their conditions. And Voice has pitched in to provide legal advice and to call on the government to enforce the regulations or write better regulations. So just to quickly cover the U.S.'s participation in all this, we also live export animals, and I think Will Potter last night in his remarks at the reception noted that the world really looks to what America does. We set the standards. If this is how we treat our animals, this is what the world looks to as a model. And that's why I think it's important that Katrina and I are here today talking about these issues, because you people are the ones that can make a difference, not just here, but in Australia and in some of these other global markets that also ship, the U.S. also ships to. In fact, the USDA here is actively working with U.S. exporters to facilitate taking advantage of the growing markets for meat in Russia, China, and Turkey. Turkey is also one of the countries where a lot of these abuses occurred, and our animals are going there as well. The cattle exports are increasing exponentially, and as are the dollar values associated with that. Also within the U.S., it's interesting to note that we have pigs being shipped overseas from the mainland to Hawaii for obviously luau and pig eating and all kinds of pork activities. So we're engaging in domestic overseas export, and also cattle raised in Hawaii, particularly at the huge Parker Ranch on the Big Island, is now almost absolutely all of them being shipped here as calves back to the mainland to be raised and slaughtered here. They can do it cheaper here apparently. So we're not immune from this industry as well. What can we do? There's just no humane way to do this project. When I was talking on the news in Australia about this, I get that question, well, what's the alternative? What's the answer? There isn't one. There isn't a good way to do this. This business needs to stop. There's other ways to get these people their meat. You can butcher them on shore if you need to have the meat and send the chilled box meat overseas. There's other answers besides putting live animals on boats. I need all of you to spread the word about this. We can reduce our consumption of animal products so they're not needed, and donate to organizations that work to ban live export. Normally when I'm wrapping up here, I realize, normally when I give speeches, I try and end it on a happy note. I think as many of my colleagues do here today. There isn't really, I would feel betraying the topic to do anything but a serious presentation. And so instead of a happy video, I have included a video of Tommy. Tommy is the one that was the country rallied behind. In the first picture I showed you of the rally, there was a picture of a poster that a person had of Tommy that was in that original Bloody Business video. It's Tommy that reminds us that, and this is not a graphic video, it just reminds us that we're not that unlike the other animals out there, that they feel and they have emotions and they understand what's happening to them. And Tommy represents each one of those other animals that are slaughtered, those 3 million every year that go overseas. I'll end with that. Again, not graphic, just poignant, I think.
Whilst those who care about animals know that they can feel fear and distress, there are some who would like us to believe otherwise. Tommy's story provides indisputable evidence that animals too can experience terror and that they are cognizant of what goes on around them. Tommy was in an abattoir in the north of Sumatra, along with several other cattle originating from the same property in the Kimberley in Western Australia. Because there weren't enough slaughtermen to kill him too, he stood alone, wide-eyed in terror and violently trembling as he watched his companions killed before him. Tommy's fate at the hands of the slaughterman was inevitable. We will ensure that his suffering and all that Tommy so clearly revealed to us will be used to build understanding about cattle and the way we should behave toward them. Importantly, Tommy's tragic final moments will play a key part in our public campaign to end the live export of all animals.
Thank you for listening. I've got some other resources up here, and I'm happy to speak with you afterwards or later today, and I think we're up for questions.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions, both our speakers.
I've wiped them out. Yeah.
Have you seen any evidence that this is about as horrific an example of a motivating factor that I think there could be, and it's on a countrywide scale, it seems from your presentation. Have you seen in Australia any evidence that vegan is becoming more of a preferred option for people? And is this in the impetus in a significant at all switch for people? I mean, if this isn't enough to make you question whether you should continue to be non-vegan, and there isn't anything that is enough, have you seen any effect of that?
I can say I don't have any hard evidence on that, but anecdotally I can tell you that I think by my second year over there, we were able to, Voices gave a grant to a bunch of people who sponsored Meat-Free Monday, which I think you have over here now. It had never been able to really get off the ground before, and it did take off, and it was really successful. Raised a bunch of money for Voiceless, and people were talking about it, and it did even better this year, is my understanding, the second year. So for whatever reason, if you contributed to that or not, people signed up for that and participated in numbers that hadn't been seen before. On the other hand, we also had women's magazines and other magazines that feature a lot of meat recipes that refused to promote Meat Free Monday and wouldn't take the ads and wouldn't run them. So some did, some didn't. And of course you get the trolls in the online debate in the articles that came up to this, saying I'll never stop. But you did get a lot of people saying I will never touch another steak. So I think there's some momentum now that there hadn't been there before, which I find positive.
I could comment on that as well. I mean, I obviously haven't been there in recent years, but even just in the years preceding Dana's arrival, there's definitely, as there is in the US, been an enormous growth in awareness and in public debate about these issues. I don't know if it's reflected in a spike in veganism. I didn't personally witness what I would call a spike in veganism. I think there's a steady increase. I don't know to what extent something like this would really influence that. I think it's more likely to generate debate and discussion about animal welfare per se. Australians are very, like Americans, they're very attached to meat, to red meat, to barbecues, to grills, to that culture. It's very much part of how the country defines itself. And what we did see, and you might comment on this as well, was a lot more talk about the chilled carcass trade, killing the animals on shore before they go overseas. There's definitely a horror at the fact that what little protection these cattle have or sheep in Australia is just stripped away from them once they reach these foreign ports. I don't think there was an awareness of that previously. But I don't know if that in and of itself is enough to lead to the kind of cultural shift overnight that you're talking about. But definitely over time. I mean, I've personally witnessed a great increase in the range of vegan products in the supermarket, and that's always reassuring because the market follows demand.
Do you think we could do the same kind of thing on America, shipping it over? Do we send it? I mean, it sounds to me like we just haven't had the documentary. I mean, I don't know.
Well, we're not even done with these egg gag efforts persist too.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, even overseas, where you're filming it, but my sense is that we do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, probably. We just don't have it. And the problem is that we won't hear about it because even if we do get the footage, they would never show that. Yeah. So we got to find the other means, and for all the complaining people do about PETA, that's exactly what they're doing.
Right.
It might not like the way they get the message across, but that's the message. They're showing you, what happens, and people, they don't want to see it, and one of my projects at ALDF before I went to Australia was to help a documentarian work on a footage about animal cruelty. We're not even talking about factory farming, just general cruelty. And was interviewing Pamela Frosch and I about that for the documentary that they were going to then pitch. And they'd sold several of them to History Channel and Documentary and A&E and things like that, true crime stories. This was one about animal crimes. And again, for a channel that shows, beheadings and sex crimes and violence, would not buy a documentary about animal violence. So we do have ways to go in terms of, getting that to the public consciousness.
What do you think makes up that culture shift? Because when you did your presentation, you mentioned that Australia is much more open, but that's not true of all media. Like when it comes to video games, very closed off. In fact, just certain video games you can't sell there. Because of how restrictive they are. So do you have an idea of why that is and how we can move America in kind of a more sensible direction about addressing those issues?
No.
Okay, no, it's not animal on topic. It's just...
I think it's interesting. I don't know which way these things are going to go, particularly with the gag laws and the like, but I do recall must have been in early 2000, there was an animal group that went into a possum abattoir and took footage of what was happening there and tried to air that on national television. And at that time, there was a huge outcry. There was a lot of litigation around whether or not that should go to air or not. So the fact that this kind of footage is now freely being aired does show a huge cultural shift in the way that Australians are thinking about these issues. But again, with at least the attempt to introduce gag laws, it's hard to say how well that's going to be thought of in the future. And of course, we don't have a First Amendment. We haven't applied freedom of political communication, which means that there has to be a lot more jockeying in the courts to actually articulate what that means and what kind of protections Australians are entitled to when it comes to airing this kind of material.
I'm curious how successful you've been gaining traction with the Australian government on this export issue, because I know at least in this country it's really hard to get our government to care beyond the scope of their jurisdiction. So how have you confronted that?
Good question. It's really, really difficult. We have some legislators who have been extremely sympathetic, including two independents who introduced their own bills in Parliament to ban it, but it went down on party lines and wasn't approved despite the public outcry. So there are some, sympathetic ears in government, but not at the highest levels. And in fact, you have the Minister for New South Wales, which is where Sydney is located, the city's in, recently, making comments about animal activists being terrorists and wanting to employ ag laws. And that was before we got a new Prime Minister who is like the Australian version of George Bush II. So it's just gotten even worse over time. We never did get a meeting despite, asking for one several times with the federal agriculture minister on this issue. Just refused to meet with us on it. We did get a little more traction at the state level, but again, it was more of a courtesy. They were not really open to listening. So it's even worse now, I would say. And as again, the violations continue, and we've got Tony Abbott, and who's made himself, the biggest chauvinist in the world, who's made himself the Minister of Women. So that's where we're starting from. Yeah.
I can comment on that as well. I don't know how many of you were at the presentation this morning with Joyce Tischler and the panel that spoke about the potential for having some kind of an independent animal welfare department in the US, as opposed to having the Department of Agriculture overseeing that extreme conflict of interest of promoting agriculture and animal welfare at the same time. We have exactly the same issue in Australia, where the Department of Agriculture is supposedly looking after industry and advancing the interests of animals. And the way that we've seen this play out, not just in the footage that you've seen today, but right across the board in all of the issues that pertain to animal protection, is that it simply doesn't work when it comes to advancing the interests of animals in any meaningful way. You cannot have the ministry that is in charge of promoting meat, looking after animals at the same time. It's just too skewed, and I think that's why we're seeing
some fundamental conflict, and it's got to change.
So I'm interested to shift us back towards the kangaroos. I'm interested in how countries and cultures socially construct and position animals that are particularly associated with those countries and cultures. So given that you talked about how there's been scientific work deconstructing the notion of kangaroos as pests, do you see that shifting the cultural position of kangaroos? Do people see them differently?
Well, yeah, I think that there's certainly been a change in perception, but I don't think it's an overnight shift. And to the extent that I think the real concern is that to the extent that there was a shift, there was simply a rebranding from these animals as pests to these animals natural resources that we can use, provided that we harvest them sustainably. There also is, and Dana, you might be able to comment more on this, that at the time that Voiceless first drew attention to the kangaroo culling issues in Australia, there was virtually no science at all in support of the fact that kangaroos were not pests. It was an accepted fact amongst scientists and the broader Australian culture that kangaroos were pests and that they had to be managed and mitigated in a way that was helpful to Australian farmers. So whilst that has moved and there's been some science, we don't have that body of science which costs money, to develop and also requires to a degree a bit of bucking the establishment in terms of the view about these issues. But Dana, did you want to comment more on that?
Not that so much, but one other thing that we tried while at Voices, which is, I think, gaining a little bit of traction and credibility for changing minds about the issue, is getting the voice of the Aboriginal community involved in the discussions with government and with the community and education, and getting them, back involved to talking about what the kangaroos mean to them and their culture and their role in it, and not just talking about it, but saying, hey, we have a say and a stake in this too. And so Voices has sort of facilitated bringing them to the fore and making sure their voices are heard in the debate as well. And I think that's got some real traction, so I'm hopeful about that.
Well, that was my follow-up question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I was interested in the quote that you showed about countries' hypocrisy about when Australia sued Japan to get them to stop the whaling, it seemed like it was a very moral-driven decision. But when you compare that to everything you talked about today, the big difference, the obvious difference to me is that you stop the whaling in Myanmar. Nobody in Australia is going to lose that confidence. If you're going to do this, it would be a big thing. So does it really just come down to money, or is there
So that's a really good question, but I think these things are, obviously when it comes to the commercial kangaroo slaughter, it's money. I mean, there is a huge industry to be built, to be expanded, that will make a lot of people in Australia a lot wealthier, and I think you hit the nail on the head there when you said that we don't have to deal with the same kind of sacrifices. Not to say that Australians are not equally passionate about those issues, but it is a form of hypocrisy. And I do believe that it impedes our moral authority to weigh into those debates.
I would just add, in addition to the money issue, which is obviously what drives a lot of what we're talking about here today, there was also an expectation, I think, by the Australian people and maybe even the government itself, that if we don't take care of this problem with Japan, it's going to be up to us and our naval forces and everyone else to be out there patrolling these, waters against these illegal fishers. And frankly, we just don't want to. We don't want to spend the resources on it. We don't want to deploy our people. This is kind of a burden on us. We're not at war. We don't want to have to be the nation's patroller of these whale sanctuary waters. So there's a little bit of a stake, a tiny stake in Australia, being the one to take Japan to court on that, but I'm sure not as much as, it was an easier sell because there isn't any kind of economic downside to it. So.
I just want to add as well that while we're on the hypocrisy train, so to speak, that the other issue that's come up in the live export debate is that when there have been consistent calls on the Australian government to cease live export, one of the arguments that we've heard is, well, if we stop doing it here, then animals from other countries are going to be live exported, and their standards are worse than ours. At least while the animals are on our boats, while they're travelling down to the ports, they have the protection of Australian law, which supposedly is more significant than these other industry places, wherever they are. I think that is a real problem when you point the finger overseas and just say, well, we're going to keep doing it because other people will do it worse than us. It's obviously an issue that is one that Australians should be much more actively vocal about when it comes to the government and the government getting moving on this.
I think we're out of time, so again, thanks for coming and happy to answer any questions. My email's up there.
So it appears to me that there are a few major world religions that require animals to be for slaughter. Those religions seem to be that list of countries. Is that Does the religious aspect come up in Australia's discussions? From what I know.
In Voices of Salmonella, and Animals Australia is the entity for the same reasons we talked about in Fox and being able to discuss it when we have those kosher slaughter. Although, after doing more investigation, and when I left there, Voices was involved in high-level talks with the Jewish community.
Well, I mean, it's easy to say.
Getting